All right, folks. So I am just outside of New York City. I went into the city this morning to get my COVID vaccination, which means that class today is going to be a little different. I made this video for you, and on top of that, there's a little bit of work to do with the essay that we read from Lacan. So I hope you enjoy it. What we're going to talk about is the Freudian model of the way the mind works. So here's what Freud believed and tried with some success to prove throughout his whole career. And remember, this was the beginning of psychology as a science. So what Freud theorized, even when he was wrong, got people moving in the direction of trying to answer questions about the mind that until then had been completely shrouded in mystery. Freud was a doctor, and he handled people, or he tried to help people who were suffering mostly from what was known at the time as hysteria. We don't really have hysteria as a modern disease, but what we would call it now is probably a variety of anxiety-related disorders, like panic disorder or social anxiety disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. These were people who were paralyzed or hysterically upset by ordinary life. And when Freud talked to these people, what he found was that what he seemed to hear from them was that they had internalized an overwhelming sense of duty, of what was expected of them. And they were so oppressed by these feelings that there was a certain way they were supposed to live and act and think, and that they weren't measuring up to it, or that they just couldn't do it for some reason. They were so oppressed by this that their selves were basically crushed. And, you know, it's worth remembering that Freud is in part trying to treat a lot of female patients who are suffering from lives that really are crushed by the horrible patriarchal traditions of sexism, which were in place at the time and are still in place now, but in certainly a less restrictive, less overwhelming sense than at the time. So Freud asked himself, well, what is this self? Where does this sense come from that we have an identity and that we have things that we want and things that we need or believe and so on? And what does it have to do with this social pressure that he saw kind of doing so much damage to his patients? Well, to try and understand this, Freud followed up on two other threads in the work that he was doing. One was a lot of people with a lot of sexual problems, either sexual abuse or sexual panic or phobias. For example, if they were homosexual and terrified of being that way and of having a sexuality that wasn't accepted by society. So Freud saw that not only was a lot of hysteria rooted in feelings of being oppressed or crushed by other people, but it was also a result of sexual desires that were either never expressed or that the person was afraid of, or that in some other way were a problem for the patient. And then Freud looked at biology, and he said, well, the basic drive of organisms on planet Earth is to reproduce, of living organisms, is to reproduce themselves. And so, we have this powerful sex drive, and that's got to be the source of the things that we do. This is right alongside of Darwin and the idea of species struggling to survive, and doing everything they could to propagate and preserve themselves. So what Darwin saw species doing on the level of physical survival, Freud said human beings were doing psychologically. They were trying to survive. They were trying to find and express love and desire, and they wanted to be recognized and free to do that. So Freud theorized that when you're born, you have all of this drive. You have this pure energy to go out there and live and survive the world and get the ones you love to love you back and to be the center of everything. And as you grow up, you learn that you cannot be the center of everything, that there are other people that, in fact, from the moment you're born, you're surrounded by people who expect things of you. Your family, whether that's your parents or your other family members, the people in your town or city, the people in your nation, and so on. So your initial kind of infantile desire to have what you want when you want it gets put down. That gets beaten back by this internalized feeling of obligation, of what it is you should do. And so Freud broke the mind of a human being into two parts that were at war with each other. And it's important that they're at war with each other because Freud believed that human beings were troubled by the way that they had to live in society. So, he tried to help troubled individuals. He saw all of society, in fact, as causing a great deal of pain. And the two warring parts of yourself are the id, which is your, and it's mentioned in Lacan, the id is your desires. It's everything you want, from food to love and sex to money to just being right, to getting to be lazy and not having to work. Everything that you want, whether it's good or bad, that is the id. That comes right out of your biological impulse to preserve yourself and expand your influence over the world. And the other side of that, at war with the id, is what Freud called the superego, which is all of these other selves of other people that are trying to tell you what to do. And that's not because they're evil, by the way. It's just the nature of society that people have to expect and receive, in fact, things from each other in a system of, mutual obligation in order for society to function at all. So the id and the superego clash. And what the individual tries to do in order not to be broken apart by this internal conflict is to carve out some space where there's like a compromise between your obligations and your desires. And if you think about it, we do this all the time. For example, I know that I want to study mechanical engineering at a good college, and that's going to fulfill my desire for fame and fortune and success. But I also accept that I have to get good grades, even in classes I don't like, because otherwise I won't get into that college and I won't be able to do the stuff that I expect. So, or that I hope to do, I should say. So we form these places of compromise between what we want and what other people want. And, the compromises that we feel are fair and safe. And that world of compromise becomes ourself, becomes what Freud called the ego. Which is sort of energized by the id. It gets its drive from things that we want, and it gets its sense of righteousness or legitimacy from other people, from the superego. And neither the id nor the superego is ever fully satisfied. They're kind of there in the background, yelling at the ego to do better. But, nonetheless, the person carries on as through the negotiation between these two poles, these two extremes of self and other. What the id doesn't get to express doesn't go away. So just because you can't have something that you want doesn't mean that your mind lets go of that desire. According to Freud, what happens is that your mind instead represses it. It becomes something that you feel is dangerous, that you can't think about even. And because, it would just make you sad in the kind of most mild sense, or it would drive you mad in the most extreme sense. So the whole world of things that you want that you can't have, things that you think but you believe, based on what other people have said aren't true, and so on, fantasies, dreams, wishes, all of that gets shut out of our conscious life most of the time, except when we're dreaming. And it goes into what Freud said was going to be called the unconscious. So that's where our notion of the unconscious comes from. It's a reservoir of all of this stuff that we desire or that we've thought that we can't let into our actual conscious thoughts that we're aware of, because the superego won't let it be there. And the unconscious is not static. It doesn't just sit there being repressed. It constantly tries to force its way back, because it's driven by the id, remember, into the light. And this is the situation of the Freudian person, the Freudian subject. They have a self, they have an unconscious, which keeps trying to add itself to the ego, to the person's identity. They have a superego, which keeps them kind of in check. And they have an id, which is supplying them with their basic will to live. And that's the model that Freud and Lacan and the rest of the psychoanalytic movement used, and have used ever since Freud kind of codified it, to understand mental illness and even normal mental states.